I remember the exact weight of that suitcase. Not because it was heavy. It wasn't. I remember it because of how light it was. Everything I owned in the world fit into a canvas bag held shut with a leather strap that my brother Eli had punched a new hole into with a nail because the original buckle had broken. 2 pairs of trousers, a spare shirt, a book on soil science I'd stolen from the county school library the week before, not out of malice, but because I knew I was never going back. I was 16 years old, standing at the end of a dirt road in Harlan County, Kentucky, watching the truck that had dropped us off disappear in a cloud of red dust. Eli was 18. Our sister May was 14, and she was holding a folded letter in both hands, the way you hold something you're not sure is real. The letter was from a lawyer named Cuthbert Haynes, of Haynes and Polk, attorneys at law, Corbin, Kentucky. It informed us that our grandmother, Vera Cass, had died on the 4th of February, 1938, and had left her entire estate to her 3 grandchildren in equal share. Her estate was a canyon, not land beside a canyon, not land overlooking a canyon. The canyon itself, 60 acres of sheer limestone walls, a narrow floor maybe 200 feet wide at its widest point, a seasonal creek that ran brown in spring and vanished to gravel in July, and the collapsed stone structure at the canyon's head that the locals called Cass's Folly. The county tax record listed the whole thing at a value of $41. The lawyer, when he had called the boarding house where we'd been staying since our father disappeared and our mother went to her sister in Harlan, had said it in the careful tone of a man delivering news he expects will be received badly. "I want you to understand," Mr. Haynes had said, "that the property is considered by most assessors to be of no commercial value. The canyon renders it unfit for agriculture, the stone structure is condemned, and the creek bed is unreliable." "What does unreliable mean?" I had asked. "It means it runs in March and it doesn't run in August," he said. "In a county that farms for a living, that's the same as useless." We went anyway. We had nowhere else to go. The road into Cass Canyon, that's what it was called, had always been called, named for our grandmother's family going back 3 generations, was a track cut along the canyon's eastern rim, narrow enough that a mule cart would have scraped both wheels against the limestone face on one side and nothing at all on the other. Eli walked it with his arms slightly out, the way you walk when you're trying not to look at how far down the fall is. May walked straight down the middle, eyes forward, chin up, the way she always faced things she was afraid of. I walked looking at the walls. The canyon was not what I expected. I had expected something like a wound in the earth, raw, ugly, inhospitable. What I found was something more like a cathedral. The limestone walls rose 60, 70, 80 feet on both sides, layered in horizontal bands of cream and rust and gray, each layer representing some ancient interval of time I could barely comprehend. Ferns and mosses grew in the shaded crevices. The walls wept moisture in long dark streaks where water seeped through fractures in the rock and ran slow fingers down toward the canyon floor. The canyon wasn't dry. The walls were saturated with water that moved through the stone the way blood moves through bone, invisibly, constantly, following channels carved over thousands of years. I noted this. I noted it carefully, the way our grandmother's books had taught me to note things. Vera Cass had been considered unusual by the county standards, which is a polite way of saying she was considered strange. She had spent 40 years in that canyon alone after her husband died of fever in 1898, raising goats, keeping a garden that people claimed shouldn't have been possible in canyon soil, and studying her land with the kind of systematic attention that most people reserve for things they love deeply or fear completely. She had, in fact, done both. Her books were in the stone structure at the canyon's head, the one the county had condemned, the one they called Cass's Folly. The condemnation was technically accurate. The roof had partially collapsed on the east side. 3 of the 4 external walls were structurally sound. The 4th was cracked along a diagonal fracture that ran from foundation to eave and would need rebuilding from the bottom up, but the books were dry. Vera had built her shelves into the western wall, the good wall, and the partial roof collapse had fallen toward the east, away from them. We found 24 volumes on geology, hydrology, cave systems, karst formations, underground water movement, and the specific limestone geology of the Cumberland Plateau. We found field notebooks, 12 of them, 2 decades of observation, documenting everything she had measured, mapped, and theorized about the canyon and the ground beneath it. And we found, nailed to the inside of the front door at eye level, a handwritten note in her angular script. The canyon is not the asset. The water is the asset. The water is not the creek. The creek is the symptom. Look beneath. May read it 3 times. Then she said, quietly, she knew we were coming. I want to tell you this was easy. I want to give you the clean version. The version where the young orphans arrive at the canyon, open the notebooks, understand the secret immediately, and begin their triumphant work. That is not what happened. What happened first was cold. February in a canyon is its own particular misery. The walls that would shade us gloriously in July trapped the cold in February like a bowl traps water. The collapsed roof let wind in. The fireplace in the stone structure smoked terribly because something, an animal, a fallen branch, was blocking the upper flue, and it took Eli 2 full days of climbing the exterior wall with a rope tied around his waist before he found and cleared it. What happened second was hunger. We had $11 between the 3 of us, which was enough for flour and salt pork and dried beans from the general store in Creston, the nearest town, 4 miles away over the rim road. We ate carefully. We counted every cup of flour. May made bread that lasted longer than bread had any right to last. Thin and dense and sustaining in the way that only food eaten by people who understand they cannot afford waste is sustaining. What happened third was the town. Creston was a farming town of about 400 people, clustered in the valley below and to the west of the canyon. They had known Vera. They had thought her strange and had mostly left her alone, which had suited everyone. When word spread that Vera's grandchildren had come to live in the canyon, 3 young people, no parents, no money, the oldest barely of age, the town reacted with a mixture of pity and amusement that felt, after a while, more like amusement than pity. The man at the general store, whose name was Mr. Pruitt, was not unkind, but he was honest in the way that feels like unkindness when you are 16 and hungry and holding exactly $11. That canyon's no place for young folks, he said, counting back my change. Your grandmama made it work because she had 40 years of practice and she was too set in her ways to admit it was killing her. You've got neither advantage. What advantage do we have? I asked. He thought about it sincerely, which I appreciated. Youth, he said finally, and probably more foolishness than sense, which amounts to the same thing in a situation like yours. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. I began reading Vera's notebooks in the first week. I read them in order, starting with the earliest dated 1918, and I read them slowly, rereading passages I didn't understand, cross-referencing them with her geology books, building a vocabulary I hadn't had before. What Vera had spent 20 years documenting was not the canyon. It was what was underneath the canyon. The canyon was a karst feature, a valley carved into soluble limestone by acidic water over millions of years. But Vera had become convinced through 2 decades of careful observation that the canyon was only the surface manifestation of a much larger system beneath. The same acidic water that had carved the canyon walls downward had also carved laterally, tunneling through the limestone in fractures and channels that connected the canyon floor to a buried cave network extending beneath the surrounding hills. The creek that ran seasonably in the canyon was not, Vera believed, a simple surface creek. It was the overflow, the visible exhaust of a pressurized underground system that moved enormous quantities of water through the limestone regardless of season, regardless of drought, regardless of what the surface creeks were doing. In wet years, the pressure increased and the water surfaced in the canyon. In dry years, the surface creek vanished, but the underground water continued moving. It simply moved deeper, staying below the canyon floor, out of sight. In Notebook 7, dated 1928, she had written, "The canyon walls sweat in August. This has always been dismissed as residual moisture from spring. It is not. I have measured the seepage rate in August, September, and October, the driest months, and it does not decrease with the dry season. It remains constant. Constant seepage in drought conditions indicates a source that is not dependent on surface precipitation. The source is below." In Notebook 9, dated 1932, she had written, "I have found the breathing place. At the canyon's northern end, where the walls narrow to 20 feet and the floor drops sharply, there is a fracture in the east wall at approximately ground level, perhaps 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall, from which cold air exhales on warm days, and into which warm air inhales on cold days. This is not wind. This is a cave system breathing with the atmospheric pressure changes. There is a large void below. The water is there." She had never found the water. Her health had declined. The canyon floor was difficult to work. The fracture she had identified, she called it the breathing place, always capitalized, was too narrow to enter, and she had lacked the tools and the physical capacity to widen it. But she had left us everything we needed to find it. Spring came slowly to the canyon, and when it came like an argument being won. The ferns crept back into the wall crevices. The canyon floor, which had seemed barren and lifeless in February, revealed itself as something else entirely. A long composted layer of leaf litter and decomposed vegetation that Vera had been building for 30 years, turning the thin canyon soil into something that could actually grow food. Her garden beds were dormant but intact, low stone walls creating terraced planting areas along the canyon's western side where afternoon sun reached the floor. The goat pen collapsed, but the stone walls of it were sound and could be rebuilt. 2 fruit trees, an apple and a pear, stood leafless but alive at the canyon's head, pruned with the careful hand of someone who had tended them for decades. May took the garden. This is important to understand. May did not help with the garden. May took it the way you take a project that belongs to you completely, the way you take ownership of a thing that others have underestimated. She spent 3 weeks rebuilding the terrace walls, turning the composted beds, identifying what had been planted and what was volunteer. She found seed packets in a tin box buried under the hearthstone. Vera had stored them there, away from moisture and rodents, and she planted with the precision of someone who had read every page of the soil science book I'd brought from the school library. Eli repaired the roof. He was a builder by instinct, could look at a structure the way some people look at faces and read what was wrong with it. He rebuilt the collapsed east side using stone he quarried from a talus pile at the canyon's north end, and he rebuilt the cracked wall from the foundation up, chinking with a clay and lime mortar he developed by trial over 2 weeks of failed batches. By April, the structure at the canyon's head was weather-tight and solid, and Eli had moved on to rebuilding the goat pen and constructing a smokehouse from the canyon's abundant fallen limestone. I studied the notebooks. I walked the canyon floor every day with Notebook 9 in my hand, reading Vera's observations against what I could see. I found the seep patterns she had documented along the east wall. I found the stand of maidenhair fern near the narrowing at the canyon's north end that she had noted always stayed green even in drought. I found the breathing place. It was exactly where she had said it would be. A fracture in the east wall at ground level, 18 inches wide, partially obscured by a collapse of smaller stones that had accumulated over the years since she had last visited it. I cleared the accumulated debris and lay flat on the canyon floor with my face at the opening. The cold air hit me like a hand pressed flat against my cheek. Not the relative cool of canyon shade, but the distinct cold of underground space. The temperature of rock that no sun had touched in geological time. And with it came a smell. Wet limestone and something deeper and older. The smell of water that had been moving through rock since before any human being had walked these hills. I put my ear to the fracture and listened. I heard water. Not the surface creek. That was 50 feet to my south and running noisily over gravel. What I heard through the fracture was something else, a low, moving sound. The sound of a larger body of water moving in a confined space, deep and constant, and entirely indifferent to the surface world above it. I walked back to the stone structure and sat at the table where Vera's notebooks were stacked, and I thought about what I had heard for a long time. Then I picked up her notebook 9 and read the last entry, dated December 1937, 6 weeks before she died. I am too old to move the rock myself, but the rock can be moved. The breathing place is a fracture, not a solid wall. The stones blocking it are collapse material, not bedrock. A young person with strong hands and patience could clear it in a season. What they would find on the other side would change everything they thought they knew about this canyon. I hope whoever reads this has strong hands. The water has been waiting long enough. I am not going to pretend the work was heroic. It was not heroic. It was slow and painful, and there were days when I lay down on the canyon floor after 8 hours of moving stone and could not determine if the ache in my arms was from the day's work or the accumulated work of weeks. And it didn't matter because the next morning I got up and did it again. The fracture was blocked by approximately 4 feet of collapsed stone. Chunks of limestone ranging from the size of my fist to pieces that outweighed me by a factor of 3. The small ones I carried. The medium ones I moved with a timber lever cut from a cedar tree that had fallen across the canyon floor. The largest ones required Eli, who came on weekends from the building work he'd found in Creston. The town had 3 structures going up that spring, and Eli's skill had gotten him employed within a week of introducing himself, and whose arms were considerably more powerful than mine. We did not tell the town what we were looking for. This was a conscious decision. I had thought about Vera, 20 years of mockery, 20 years of being the strange woman in the canyon with her strange ideas about underground water, and I had decided that the time to involve the town was after we had found what she had mapped, not before. We told people we were clearing a drainage issue. Nobody asked follow-up questions. By late June, 4 months after we had arrived, we had cleared the fracture to a depth of 3 feet and widened it to approximately 3 feet across. The cold air coming through was now strong enough to move my hair when I leaned close. The water sound was clearer. I could hear it without pressing my ear to the opening, a steady, low rushing that never varied in volume or pitch. On July 12, 1938, a Tuesday afternoon, Eli and I widened the fracture enough that a person could pass through it sideways, turned flat. I went first. I had one lantern and a length of rope tied around my waist, with the other end held by Eli outside. The fracture opened into a passage about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide that ran into the hillside at a gentle downward angle. I moved along it bent at the waist, holding the lantern ahead of me, the rope dragging behind. 20 feet in, the passage opened. I stood up straight for the first time in 20 feet and lifted the lantern. The cavern was enormous. I say enormous, I mean it was larger than anything I had expected, larger than any void I had understood could exist beneath ordinary ground. My lantern reached only part way to the far wall. The ceiling arched somewhere above the lantern's light, lost in darkness. The floor sloped gently toward the center, and along the center of the floor, in a channel it had carved over thousands of years, ran a river. Not a creek, a river. 6 feet wide, perhaps 2 feet deep, running with the steady, unhurried confidence of something that had been running for longer than the canyon above it had existed. The water was perfectly clear. The limestone bed beneath it was pale and smooth. The sound it made was the low, constant sound that I had been hearing through the fracture for 4 months. I set the lantern down on a limestone shelf, and I knelt at the river's edge, and I put my hands in. The water was cold enough to hurt. It was the coldest water I had ever felt, the cold of deep stone and ancient darkness, and it ran between my fingers with a completeness that made me understand, all at once, what Vera had spent 20 years trying to tell people. Underneath 60 acres of canyon that the county had valued at $41 and considered useless, there was a river. There was always a river. I sat on the canyon floor beside that underground river for a long time. I thought about Vera. I thought about the notebooks and the 20 years of careful documentation, and the town that had called her strange, and the lawyer who had delivered her estate with apologetic eyes, and the county assessor who had put $41 on it. And I thought about all of the things in this world that are dismissed and laughed at and written off, not because they have no value, but because the people doing the valuing are only looking at the surface. Then I crawled back through the passage and I told Eli. He said nothing for a long time. He sat on the canyon floor with his back against the east wall and looked at the fracture opening with the expression he got when he was building something in his mind, a look of precise spatial calculation. "How deep is the ceiling from the canyon floor?" he asked finally. "I don't know exactly. 40 feet maybe, 50. And the river runs year-round?" Vera documented it running in the driest August on record. She believed the source was the limestone formation beneath Creston Ridge, which gets precipitation from 3 watersheds. It doesn't depend on local rain. Eli was quiet again. Then he said, "We can bring the water up. Not without equipment. We don't need equipment. We need elevation." He stood up and walked to the fracture and looked into it. If the river is 40 feet below canyon floor, and the canyon floor is 60 feet below the rim, and the farms in the valley are at the same elevation as the canyon rim, then a pipe from the cavern to the canyon floor is 40 feet of rise. But a pipe from the cavern through the canyon wall to the valley side of the ridge would be running downhill. I understood what he was saying. "Natural pressure," I said. "Natural pressure. The water is under pressure from the column above it. If we give it an outlet at a lower elevation than its source, it will flow on its own. No pump, no engine, no fuel. Just gravity and a pipe." We were not engineers. We were 18 and 16 years old with 2 years of combined high school education and the library of our grandmother's geology books. But Vera had anticipated this too in Notebook 11. The cavern river enters from the northeast through a fracture in the back wall below the waterline. It exits, or would exit if there were an exit, through the southwest wall, which is the wall that faces the valley. The southwest wall shows evidence of a former resurgence point, sealed by collapse perhaps a century ago. The pressure differential between the aquifer's input elevation and the valley's surface elevation would be sufficient to drive a flow of substantial volume without any mechanical assistance. The valley would simply need to be lower than the origin point, which it is, by approximately 90 feet. Our grandmother had designed the solution. She had left us the blueprints. We spent the rest of that summer in the cavern. Eli engineered a way to lower materials through the widened fracture. He built a wooden frame around the opening, flush with the canyon wall, and rigged a simple rope and pulley system using cedar poles set in cracks in the wall face. We lowered tools and timber, and eventually ourselves without ropes, because the passage had become familiar. The southwest wall of the cavern was, as Vera had written, the valley-facing wall. I found the former resurgence point by the discoloration of the stone, a section of wall about 4 feet across that had a different texture than the surrounding limestone, lighter in color and less crystalline, characteristic of a surface that had once been water-smoothed and had since been covered by collapsed material. We chiseled. We worked with the cold water running 3 feet away, lighting the work with 2 lanterns hung from cracks in the ceiling, the sound of the underground river constant and patient in the background. Eli chipped at the limestone with a steel chisel and a 7-pound hammer he had brought from the building work in Creston. I cleared the debris as it fell, passed it back through the passage in buckets, hauled it up the pulley and out onto the canyon floor. It was the slowest work I have ever done. It was also the most deliberate. Each piece of limestone that Eli removed had been placed there by time and gravity, and each removal had to be considered. He read the fracture patterns the way he read building structures, understanding which pieces were bearing load and which were free to remove. Once we misjudged it, and a section of wall collapsed inward, filling the space between us with debris and dust, and a sound like a shelf of books falling. And we both stood in the darkness until the dust settled and found each other by voice, and then by hand, and neither of us said anything about it afterward. By the 1st of October, Eli's chisel broke through. The sound was different from breaking stone. It was a lower sound, and it was followed immediately by a rush of air and then by a thin line of daylight, actual daylight, pale and gray in the October afternoon, coming through a crack no wider than my finger. Eli put his eye to it. "Valley," he said. "I can see the valley." We widened the opening over 3 days. By the 4th day, it was large enough for Eli to wedge himself into and push the remaining section of collapsed limestone outward onto the hillside. He disappeared through the opening for 10 minutes and came back with pine needles on his shoulders and a look on his face I had never seen before. "You need to come out," he said. "You need to see where we are." I followed him through. We emerged onto the valley-facing side of the canyon's limestone formation, on a slope about 200 feet above the valley floor, invisible from the valley below because the opening was recessed into a fold of the hillside. From that fold, the valley spread below us in the October afternoon light. Farms and fields and woodlots, and the cluster of buildings that was Creston, brown and gold and ordinary in the autumn. The valley had no idea what was about to come out of the hill above it. Let us know in the comments from which part of the world you are watching this video. If you're enjoying our videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The water came on November 3rd, 1938. Eli had spent 2 weeks fabricating a clay pipe system. He was not a plumber, but he understood how water moves through sealed channels. The building work in Creston had given him direct experience with drain systems, and he approached the problem the way he approached all problems, with patient, physical intelligence. He built a run of clay pipes, each section sealed at the joints with a waterproof clay and ash compound, running from the opening he had made in the cavern's southwest wall to the outlet on the valley-facing hillside. The pipe run was about 60 feet of total length. It descended at an angle of roughly 15 degrees from the cavern opening to the outlet. If Vera's pressure calculations were correct, that was enough. We did not have a ceremony. We did not have an audience. It was a gray November morning, the 3 of us and nobody else, and Eli removed the temporary stone plug he had placed in the cavern end of the pipe and stepped back, and we waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a trickle came from the valley outlet, then a flow. Then a steady, clean, heavy stream of water poured from the pipe onto the hillside, ran down the slope in a silver thread, and entered the valley at the base of the hill as a creek that had never existed before in any map or any living memory. May made a sound I cannot fully describe. It was half laugh and half something older than laughter. She walked down the hillside and sat in the water and put her hands in it, and looked at it running over her palms and said nothing for a long time. The creek ran. It ran that day, it ran that week, it ran through November and December and January and into the next spring, and it did not stop. The valley below watched a new creek appear on their hillside from apparently nowhere and produce a volume of water that didn't vary with the weather and couldn't be explained by surface drainage, and they came. Individually at first, then in groups, to look at it and ask questions that we answered honestly. There is water under the canyon. No, we didn't drill. The water found its own way. Our grandmother mapped it. It took 20 years. Yes, it runs in August. Yes, it runs in drought. Yes, the source is below the limestone formation and doesn't depend on surface precipitation. No, it won't run dry. The winter of 1939 was a hard winter, and not particularly dry, and the valley had its own wells and didn't much need our creek. We were still the cast children in the canyon, the orphans, the strange ones, the young people living in their grandmother's folly with their inexplicable new creek. Mr. Pruitt at the general store was friendly and no longer pitying, which was a form of progress. What changed everything was the summer of 1940. It started dry in late May. By June, the fields were showing stress. Crops that should have been tall were short, and the color of the valley was a degree or 2 paler than it should have been. By July, the creek beds in the valley had dropped to the rocks. By August, the wells were dropping. We heard about it from people who came to look at our creek with a different expression than they'd worn before. The curiosity was gone from their faces, replaced by something more urgent and less comfortable. The first family to come to us about water was the Holloways. who farmed 100 acres on the valley's western edge. Their well had dropped below youthful depth in the second week of August. Harrison Holloway was 53 years old, a large, quiet man with the permanent tan line of someone who wore his hat every day of his life. He came to the canyon rim on a Sunday afternoon and stood there, looking down until I came out to see what he wanted. He said, "That creek of yours, it's still running." "It's still running," I said. "Our well's dry." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man of dignity, and dignity was making this harder for him. I didn't make it harder. "Come down," I said. "Bring your family, bring your neighbors, bring whatever you need to carry water in." He looked at me. "What do you charge?" "Nothing." "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "Because it's not mine to charge for. It was here before I was born. It'll be here after I'm dead. I just found the way out for it." He came the next day with his wife and 2 sons and 4 large barrels in the back of his wagon. He came the day after that with his neighbors. By the 3rd week of August, there was a line forming at the valley outlet of our pipe every morning. Families with wagons and mule carts and carried buckets, filling containers and making the trip back to farms where crops were dying and livestock were thirsty. We gave it all away. Every drop. Eli rigged the second pipe run from the cavern to increase the output volume. May organized a schedule so families knew when to come and didn't make the trip for nothing. I walked the canyon and managed the intake, watching the cavern river's level. It never dropped noticeably, never slowed, never indicated stress from the drought raging on the surface above it. The underground river didn't know about the drought. It had its own weather, its own seasons, its own calendar measured not in months but in the slow movement of water through limestone over centuries. The drought was a surface problem, and our water was not surface water. There is something I want to say about the people who came to that hillside with their empty barrels. They had laughed, not all of them and not cruelly, but the canyon had been a joke for a long time, and we had been part of that joke. The children in Creston called Eli Cave Boy for a while, which he pretended not to hear. A woman in the general store had asked May once whether we had found any treasure in the canyon yet, with a smile that meant she thought we hadn't and never would. Mr. Pruitt had been kind and doubting in equal measure. None of that mattered to me when the drought came. I want to be precise about this. The satisfaction I felt watching people fill their barrels from our creek was not the satisfaction of vindication. It was not the satisfaction of being right after being mocked. Those are small satisfactions, and they belong to small people, and I have spent my life trying not to be a small person. The satisfaction I felt was the satisfaction of Vera Cass's work finally being used for the purpose she had designed it for. 20 years of notebooks, 20 years of careful measurement and dismissed theory and being considered the strange woman in the canyon. She had spent her last healthy years mapping a water source for a valley that didn't know it needed one yet, and when the valley finally needed it, the map was there. That is what mattered. That is what the satisfaction was made of. I did have one moment of something that wasn't pure. It came when Mrs. Roper, whose husband ran the town council and who had 2 years earlier described our arrival in the canyon to her neighbor loudly enough for May to hear as those 3 children playing house in their grandmother's ruin, came to the outlet with her household water barrels. She didn't speak to me directly, she spoke to her daughter, but she came and she took the water and she came back the next week. I thought, "Vera, this one's for you." Then I moved on. The drought broke in October. Rain came in quantities that made everyone forget, briefly, how desperate August had been. The valley's wells refilled. The creeks ran. Life returned to the comfortable assumption that water was something that simply existed, like air, like ground, like the permanence of things that have always been there. Our creek kept running. This was, in its quiet way, the more important demonstration. Anyone could understand the creek that ran in drought. What changed the valley's understanding was a creek that kept running identically. Same volume, same clarity, same temperature, in wet years as in dry ones. It was not dependent on precipitation. It was not seasonal. It was structural, fundamental, geological. The product of a water system so deep and so large that surface weather was simply irrelevant to it. Eli came to me in the winter of 1940 with a proposal. He had been doing building work in Creston for 2 years and had earned enough, carefully saved, to buy materials. He wanted to build a proper spring house at the creek outlet with a stone basin and overflow channels, and a structure above it where dairy goods could be kept cold. He wanted to build a formal path from the valley floor to the outlet, graded and stable for wagon access. "We're not going to stay hidden," he said. "The creek is already out. We might as well make it useful to more people." May had her own proposal, a seed exchange. She had been cultivating the canyon garden for 2 years and had developed varieties of vegetable seed specifically adapted to the canyon's unusual microclimate. The high walls creating shade patterns unlike anything in the open valley. The constant moisture from the weeping walls creating a humidity that valley farms didn't have. Her seeds grew differently in the canyon. They might grow differently elsewhere, and the only way to know was to share them. I had spent 2 years with Vera's notebooks. Now I wanted to make them accessible. I proposed a lending library, the notebooks and geology books, supplemented by additional volumes I had been acquiring from wherever I could find them, available to anyone in the valley who wanted to understand what they were living on top of. "Nobody's going to read geology books," Eli said. "The right people will," I said. "The people who look at a field and think about what's underneath it. The ones who've been wondering about things and not had a word for what they're wondering about." Vera was one of those people. There are more. He was skeptical. He was wrong. The first person to borrow from the library was a 15-year-old boy named Orville Watts, the son of a coal miner from the eastern edge of the county, who had been spending his Saturdays at the creek outlet since the drought because he said the sound of the water coming out of the hillside made him feel less like the world was as narrow as it appeared from where he stood. He borrowed the field guide to springs and aquifers and returned it 3 weeks later with a list of questions written on the back of a feed store receipt that he handed to me with the book. The questions were careful, specific, and showed a mind that had been working seriously with the material. I answered them as fully as I could and gave him Notebook 7. 3 months later, he came back with his own notebook, a dime store composition book, showing me observations he had been making on his family's property. He had found surface signs of subsurface water movement on the eastern slope of their land, temperature anomalies, moisture-loving plant species, a shallow depression in the ground that matched Vera's description of a collapsed sinkhole. "I think there's water under our land," he said. "I think there's been water under our land my whole life and nobody knew it." He was 17 by then. He went on to study geology at the University of Kentucky on a scholarship arranged by a professor who had come to see the canyon after reading a brief notice about the underground river in the State Geological Survey Quarterly. He became a hydrologist. He spent his career documenting water resources in the Appalachian region that had been overlooked because they were underground, because they were in poor valleys, because the people who knew about them were the wrong kind of people. He credited Vera Cass in the acknowledgments of his doctoral dissertation. He credited us, too. I am going to skip forward because the years after 1940 were good years in the way that working years are good. Not dramatic, not easy, but solid and purposeful and building towards something cumulative. Eli built the spring house and the valley road and eventually a proper mill powered by a channel he diverted from our creek's output, which ground grain for valley families on the same terms as the water. No charge, because the power to run it cost us nothing. May expanded the garden until the canyon's terrace floor was fully planted, and her seed exchange became the kind of institution that rural communities build around things that genuinely work. Informal, persistent, passed person to person, remembered in the way youthful things are remembered. I taught. Not formally, not in a schoolroom. I taught at the library, which was, to be accurate, a shelf of books in the stone structure at the canyon's head, and at the creek outlet, and on walks through the canyon with anyone who wanted to understand what they were looking at. I married in 1944. His name was George Prater, a soft-spoken man who had grown up in the valley and had come to the canyon one afternoon to fill water barrels during the drought, and had come back the following week to return a borrowed book, and had kept returning, ostensibly for books, until it became clear that the books were not the only reason he was coming. He was a farmer who thought about land the way Vera had thought about it, with the long, patient attention of someone who understood that the surface was only the beginning of the story. He took to the canyon like he had always belonged to it. We had 2 children in the canyon. They grew up knowing what was underneath the ground they played on, knowing about the underground river and the cavern and Vera's notebooks and the 20 years of dismissed work that had made all of it possible. I told them their great-grandmother's story not as a lesson about perseverance, though it was that, but as a lesson about the specific kind of courage required to keep believing in something accurate when the people around you believe it is nonsense. That is a harder courage than most kinds. It does not look heroic from outside. It looks like stubbornness, eccentricity, isolation. It only looks like courage in retrospect, when the thing turns out to be true. The State Geological Survey published the formal assessment of the Cass Canyon aquifer system in 1951. Dr. Lewis Marsh, the lead hydrologist, had spent 3 weeks in the cavern with instruments, measuring flow rates, mapping the channel system, testing the water, estimating the volume of the total aquifer. His assessment concluded that the underground system beneath Cass Canyon was one of the largest unrecorded freshwater reserves in the Cumberland Plateau region, with a sustainable yield sufficient to supply a rural population far larger than Crescent and its surroundings. He asked me, at the end of his assessment visit, how my grandmother had known. "She observed carefully," I said, "for 20 years, without any instruments, without any funding, without any credibility in the community's estimation." "She was right about everything," he said. "Her pressure calculations, her flow estimates, her identification of the resurgence point. She was right about all of it." I told him their great-grandmother's story not as a lesson about perseverance, though it was that, but as a lesson about the specific kind of courage required to keep believing in something accurate when the people around you believe it is nonsense. That is a harder courage than most kinds. It does not look heroic from outside. It looks like stubbornness, eccentricity, isolation. It only looks like courage in retrospect when the thing turns out to be true. A canyon purchased for just $41 in 1938, dismissed by everyone as worthless land, became the foundation of a lasting legacy built on patience, stubborn observation, and hidden truth. Vera Cass, a self-taught geologist born in 1872, spent 20 years meticulously documenting geological details of the canyon. She measured seep rates, recorded observations in numbered notebooks, and tracked breathing places in the limestone, all without formal training or scientific instruments. Nobody believed her. The county assessor, lawyers, and generations of valley residents had looked at the dry creek bed and crumbling canyon walls and written the place off as a joke. But Vera kept looking beneath the surface. Her work was eventually validated when a hydrologist formally assessed the canyon and cited her notebooks by date and observation number, calling her methodology informal but rigorous, and her conclusions substantially accurate. It was the first time any institution had acknowledged what she had spent a lifetime doing. What Vera had found was an underground river, a year-round aquifer flowing beneath the seasonal creek bed. This discovery transformed everything. In 1955, the Creston Valley Water Cooperative was chartered, drawing from the Cass Canyon aquifer through a pipe network engineered by Eli. The cooperative was built on a non-negotiable principle. Water would be free to all valley households, regardless of income. George, the narrator's husband, argued powerfully that a system charging for water would fail the poorest families at exactly the moment of greatest need. The board agreed, 6-2. George died in 1967, working in the orchard inside the canyon, hands still in the work he had helped build. The narrator continued on. Decades later, the canyon is home to a heritage water research center, a working farm, and an educational program serving school children from 3 counties. Vera's notebooks sit in a glass case, honored at last. The piece closes with a profound challenge to the reader. Look beneath what has been dismissed in your own life. The surface deceives. True value runs deeper, like a river that has always been there, waiting for someone stubborn enough to find it.